few years ago, I was sat at a conference dinner with Professor of Social Marketing Alan Tapp from the University of the West of England. And we were discussing our experiences as cyclists and the risk that we experienced from different types of drivers. And we ended up in a debate about were there certain brands that produced the worst behavior to experience as a cyclist, those things that made you feel most at risk. And we had ended up alighting on two different brands of vehicle. Well, it spawned the idea for an interesting piece of research that would examine exactly that. Could we measure empirically whether there were different risks posed by different populations of drivers according to the vehicles that they chose to drive? Was there anything that we could do with the Stats 19 data set that it would allow us to isolate the specific effect of vehicle brands? And what I want to take you through in the next few minutes is an exploration of that research, which late last year was published in the Journal of Social Marketing. I love this quote from the film Harry Potter when he goes into Mr. Ollivander's shop in order to select his first wand on his way to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. And Ollivander says to him, "The wand chooses the wizard, Mr. Potter. It's not always clear why." And that's in a way how I think about this question of vehicle brand and risk-taking behavior. Does the driver choose the vehicle because of certain aspects of their character that entice them towards risk taking? Or is there some way in which the vehicle brand attracts the driver? And I think what we've been trying to explore is, are there ways in which those things come together, and can we find the magic mix of brand and personality that leads to risk taking? Some of you will be quite familiar with the idea that health outcomes are not informed entirely by internal, certainly not rational individual decision making, but they happen in a wider context. So Dahlgren and Whitehead's social determinants of health will be familiar to some. The idea that our health outcomes as individuals are informed by our environment, by our friends, our family, our social connections, our culture. Some of those things that influence us will affect the health outcomes that we have. We've anchored this piece of work in the concept of commercial determinants of health. That is, there are some health outcomes that are equally shaped by commercial activities within the wider society around us. We're quite familiar with this idea in terms of tobacco or alcohol or even maybe food, but it's an interesting area of study to look at injury prevention through a lens of commercial influence on behaviours that might ultimately have negative health outcomes. And some of this is as old as the story of the motor car itself. When Henry Ford first decided to put the motor vehicle into mass production, he actually had some pretty idealistic aims. Here's a quote that is attributed to him. He said, "I will build a motor car for the great multitude. It will be large enough for the family, but small enough for the individual to run and care for. It will be constructed of the best materials by the best men to be hired, after the simplest design that modern engineering can devise. But it will be so low in price that no man making a good salary will be unable to own one and enjoy with his family the blessing of hours of pleasure in God's great open spaces." It was a great ambition that the motor car would liberate individual mobility and certainly not sacrifice safety the way that we have seen in terms of global road traffic injury. I guess we're all probably slightly more familiar with his comment that any customer can have a car painted any colour that he wants so long as it is black. But once you move beyond Henry Ford's Model T and you begin to get the proliferation of vehicle brands in the market, you start to see an interesting phenomenon that we observe in other markets, which is that manufacturers feel the need to differentiate their products in order to gain some competitive advantage. How do they persuade us otherwise that their product is better than some others? For many years, vehicle manufacturers have recognized this idea of brand personality, and they have invested their vehicles with those brand values. And so it might be that we as an individual consider ourselves to be reliable and dependable and serious as an individual. Those are our values, and those are what we want to communicate to others around us. And we want our vehicle to espouse those values as well, or to amplify them and communicate them to others. It might be that you consider yourself to be much more dynamic and charismatic and passionate and expressive. And similarly, you might choose a vehicle that conveys something more of those values. Manufacturers have adapted and adopted and developed their vehicle fleets in order to convey something of that brand personality, giving us a choice in the market that allows us to express our intrinsic personal values and beliefs through the vehicle that we buy. And marketing teams have gone to great length to communicate those values to us then in some of the messages that they convey. So when you see advertising, they are pulling on some of those values within the brand, on our emotions as consumers, to try and connect them and engage us in order to make that purchasing decision and to choose a vehicle that suits our personality. Now, here are some quotes that are taken from American marketing literature, from a study that looked at this specific issue, and which seeks to identify the fact that actually there's not only some very emotive language that's used, but actually some of the language could be quite provocative and could inspire behaviors that were associated with quite negative outcomes. So Harris in this paper points to adverts that invite drivers to conquer the streets of America with an aggressive and intimidating fleet. Purchase a Dodge and enter the Brotherhood of Muscle. The company sells cars named Charger, Demon, and Ram. Consumers can choose, among others, to acquire a Ford Tough truck or a BMW with a design that dominates. They're appealing to something within us that brand can hopefully satisfy. But equally, it might be associated with behaviours and outcomes that have negative consequences. So what do we think is going on here? Well, this slide presents a slight adaptation of Fiona Filan's psychological model of behaviour, and simply posits that the performance identifiers within the branding are seeking to influence something within the psychology of the individual that is then associated with outcomes in terms of risky driving. So there are a number of things that we know influence our behavior as individuals. Things like our norms, how we think other people behave, especially those who are more immediate to us. Our sense of self-efficacy or control. So if we think that we are a skillful driver, we might choose a vehicle that pulls on that emotionally and also conveys that to others. Our own sense of self-identity. If we think that we are taking our driving seriously, we want to convey that in the brand that we choose, rather than a vehicle that's more fun or perhaps conveys something more steady. Our own attitudes, our own thinking attitudes. So whether we consider that we could make a sound assessment of the risks that we're taking, we believe our own judgments, and also our feeling attitudes. So what's it like when we're behind the wheel? Do we feel confident and assertive when we're driving? And does the brand play into that? Because all of that connects to our behavioral willingness and our behavioral intentions. So it might be that when we feel like that, we're going to choose to behave like that. We may even get behind the wheel of the car intending to behave in certain ways that are risky. So analytically, what did we do? Well, as I said, we started this project with a conversation a few years ago. So we at that time took several years worth of Stats 19 data and the associated vehicle brands of the vehicles that were involved in crashes. We isolated those ones where the police attending the scene reported what we might describe as an injudicious action. So things where the driver appears to have made an error, a contravention of road traffic law. So they have been following too close, they've exceeded the speed limit, they failed to stop for appropriate signals and markings, that sort of thing. We identified over 400,000 drivers in crashes who had been attributed those where we could match the vehicle brand. But what we wanted to be able to do was to isolate that bit which might be associated with the brand of the vehicle. And so we created a multi-level logistic regression that allowed us to control for exposure of those number of those vehicles within the fleet, those which tend to be driven more by men than by women, those which are driven longer distances rather than those that are driven shorter distances, the sorts of roads that they drive on, because motorways actually mile for mile are safer than some of our A road network. And so we used a number of variables to isolate that bit that we considered to be most relevant, seemed to be isolating the bit that was associated with brand. So we could identify a brand gradient that showed which brands might be most strongly associated with high-risk driving. And these are the results. So the black dots indicate where the calculated measure of risk associated with a brand came out, from the least risky brands on the left-hand side up to the most risky brands on the right-hand side. And the error bars reflect the fact that vehicles are not evenly distributed amongst brands within the fleet. So there are more Fords in the fleet than there are Daewoo's, for example. And so those error bars are important in terms of considering exactly where brands would come within this risk gradient. But what you do see as quite a strong theme coming out is that those brands which have a tendency towards status, towards high power, towards performance, tend to come towards the right-hand edge of the graph. And brands that we might consider to be a more economical choice, perhaps more sensible, lower powered, bit steadier, tend to come towards the left-hand side of the graph. So it would appear that it resonates with, I guess, our intuitions around where the brand might have the impact in terms of risky driving behaviour. But it also helps us to highlight those vehicle manufacturers who arguably need to be doing more to strengthen the security and safety of their fleet and to ensure that their driver community is not exposed to such high levels of risk. So what might we do about it? Well, on the screen now is the Nuffield ladder of interventions, and it basically moves from not doing anything through to a much higher regulatory environment where you eliminate the choices of consumers. And we know that those schemes which have very little teeth, self-regulatory programs on behalf of manufacturers, tend to not have great impact in terms of behavior, in terms of outcomes, health outcomes. So we would certainly be suggesting that consideration needs to be given towards the upper levels of the ladder of interventions. And it might be that actually there's something about ensuring that manufacturers bear the cost of the risk that they introduce to the network. It's not ultimately the manufacturers, the brands who are behind the wheel, but they need to be cognizant that their vehicles are involved in higher rates of exposure to risk, and therefore they are carrying onto our networks increased poor outcomes in terms of injury and health, and therefore something to regulate that, even if that's enforcing the implementation of new technologies and early adoption of advanced driver assistance systems. That would be a step in the right direction. If you'd like to find out some more about the paper, and especially if you'd like to hear a discussion between myself and my co-authors, Alan Tapp and George Osaki, then one great way that you can do that is to download our Think Agilysis podcast. that deals with this, where we had a good half-hour conversation about some of the issues that the paper raises and some of the things that we might seek to do to address it. So do head on over there and listen to the podcast. Thank you very much for your time and attention. My contact details are on the screen for you now. If there's anything else that you'd like to know about this paper, or indeed anything else that we do at Agilysis, please just get in touch. Enjoy the rest of Joining the Dots.